A dark-skinned, heavy-set man stepped into the grand lobby of one of New York's most luxurious hotels. He had reserved the gold-plated suite, the most expensive room in the entire building. He looked calm, quiet, and polite. But instead of a warm welcome, the concierge glanced at him, sneered, and let out a mocking laugh, commenting on his size and appearance. No one in that lobby knew who this man really was. No one imagined that within hours, he would shake the foundation of the hotel's values, forcing it to confront its deepest flaws. Stay with us. What happens next will leave you speechless. His name was Marcus. He was 42, with warm brown skin and a large, heavy-set frame. He walked with purpose, calm but firm, his steps steady across the gleaming marble floor. There was no flashiness in how he dressed. Just a clean white button-up shirt, navy trousers, polished shoes, and a timeless leather bag in one hand. Everything about him spoke of quiet confidence, the kind built over years of knowing exactly who you are. Marcus had just stepped off a long-haul flight. His eyes carried the weariness of travel, but his expression remained composed. He entered the Crystal Lux, one of the most luxurious hotels in Manhattan, a place known not just for its golden interiors and rooftop views, but for catering exclusively to elite clientele. The kind of place where guests didn't wait in line, and names alone opened doors. He made his way to the front desk, nodded politely, and offered a soft greeting. "Good evening," he said, placing a printed confirmation and his ID on the marble counter. "I have a reservation. The gold-plated suite." His voice was low and calm, yet it carried a natural authority. There was no doubt in his tone, only respect. Across from him stood Brad, the concierge on duty. Young, sharply dressed, with slicked back hair and a name tag that read Concierge Supervisor, Brad glanced at Marcus without returning the greeting. His eyes dropped from Marcus's face to his round belly, then slowly climbed back up. He didn't reach for the reservation immediately. Instead, he tilted his head, narrowed his eyes slightly, and allowed a slow, smug smile to spread across his lips. "Gold-plated suite," Brad repeated, drawing out the words as if tasting something bitter. He chuckled softly under his breath, not loud, but enough to be noticed. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" he added, his voice laced with mock politeness, eyes glinting with condescension. Marcus didn't answer right away. Behind him, a well-dressed couple whispered to each other. A teenage boy nearby leaned in to get a better look. The mood in the lobby shifted, curiosity mixing with silent judgment. Some looked amused, others surprised. No one stepped in. Still, Marcus didn't flinch. His posture remained firm, shoulders relaxed, eyes calm. He looked Brad straight in the face and responded in the same even tone, "Yes, I booked the suite. Please check the reservation." No anger, no frustration, only the kind of control that comes from long experience. From knowing this wouldn't be the last time someone looked at him and assumed he didn't belong. Brad tapped a few keys on the keyboard, his fingers moving lazily. Then he leaned back and shook his head. "Sorry," he said flatly, "I don't see any reservation under the name Marcus." He didn't try to double-check, didn't ask for a different spelling. His voice was casual, dismissive, as if the matter didn't deserve real attention. Marcus remained calm, though his eyebrows lifted slightly. He reached back into his folder and held up the printed confirmation again, quietly pointing to the booking number. But Brad wasn't finished. With a mocking smile, Brad looked Marcus up and down once more. "Maybe you got the wrong place," he said. "The restaurant next door is hiring kitchen help. Might want to check there instead." The jab hit harder than it sounded. It wasn't just about the reservation anymore. It was about status, about appearance, about where someone like Marcus was supposed to belong. From across the lobby, a white woman in a bright red dress turned and let out a loud laugh. "Oh my God," she said to her friend, not even whispering. "I thought he was someone famous for a second." Marcus's jaw tightened, but his expression didn't change. He had been through this before. He closed his eyes for a brief second, let out a breath, and said, "Can you please check again? Here's the code." His voice was even softer this time, as if he didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing him react. Brad sighed, rolled his eyes slightly, and started typing again. This time, his screen lit up. The reservation appeared, clear, confirmed, and paid in full. Not just any room, but the most expensive suite in the hotel. The gold-plated suite on the top floor. For a moment, Brad blinked. His confidence faltered, just a little. But it came back just as quickly. He didn't apologize. Didn't look Marcus in the eye. "Your room's on the 42nd floor, he said, tossing the keycard onto the counter. "You can find your way up, right?" Marcus looked down at the card, then back up at Brad. He didn't respond. He didn't argue. He simply picked up his luggage, gave a slight smile that held more strength than words, and turned toward the elevator without saying a word. Charlotte, the hotel manager, had just stepped out of a meeting room when she saw Marcus passing by. Her posture straightened instinctively. She was known for being sharp, composed, and highly protective of the hotel's image. She noticed Marcus immediately. His size, his calm, his presence, it all stood out against the polished marble and cold elegance of crystal looks. She opened her mouth to greet him, a courteous good evening ready on her lips. But Marcus only gave her a polite nod and continued walking without stopping. He didn't seem angry. He didn't even seem surprised. That silence, however, said more than words could have. Charlotte turned her head slightly, watching him disappear into the elevator. A few seconds later, Brad walked up beside her with a smug expression. His voice was low, but sharp enough to cut. "Can you believe he booked the gold suite?" Brad said. "Dressed like that, walking in like he owns the place. He looks like someone who should be washing dishes in the back, not staying in the penthouse." Charlotte's eyes narrowed. She turned to Brad, and her voice was colder than marble. "You should be careful with your words," she said. Brad shrugged, clearly unfazed. "He's not a regular. Never stayed here before. Probably hit the lottery or got a lucky bonus. People like that show up once, make a scene, and disappear." Charlotte didn't smile. Her jaw tensed, and her eyes stayed fixed on Brad's face. "Are you absolutely sure," she asked, "that your treatment of him wasn't based on anything other than policy?" Brad chuckled. "I'm just being honest. This hotel has standards. And people like that," he said, motioning toward the elevator, "don't fit the image. It's not about race or weight. It's about class. We have a reputation." Charlotte didn't reply. Not right away. She looked down at the counter where Marcus's keycard had been tossed minutes earlier. Her mind began to piece things together. Not just what Brad had said, but how he had said it. The tone. The ease. The assumption that no one would call him out. She turned away without another word, but her silence was heavy. Something about the encounter didn't sit right. Something about Marcus, the way he carried himself, his quiet dignity, it stayed with her. And so did Brad's words. Marcus opened the door to his suite and stepped inside. The room glowed with luxury. Gold trim lined the walls, the ceilings were carved with delicate detail, and the chandelier shimmered with soft light. Velvet curtains framed floor-to-ceiling windows, revealing a sweeping view of the city skyline. The furniture gleamed, every inch designed to impress. But Marcus barely looked around. His face showed no awe, no excitement. Only quiet focus. He walked calmly to the mahogany desk near the window, set his bag down, and pulled out a sleek laptop. His fingers moved with practiced ease as he opened a file titled, Lux Hotels Expansion, Confidential. Pages of internal documents filled the screen. Growth reports, customer feedback, employee conduct audits. He scrolled slowly, absorbing the numbers, the notes, the patterns. After a moment, he picked up his phone and dialed. His voice was steady. "I've arrived," he said. "It's exactly what I thought it would be." The voice on the other end was a woman's, calm and direct. "What's your impression so far? Do we move forward?" Marcus exhaled softly. His eyes didn't leave the screen. "Not yet," he said. "I want to observe more. The issue is deeper than I expected. It's not just about a rude employee. It's cultural. Something is broken at the core." He closed the file, then reached for a leather-bound notebook. He opened to a blank page and wrote across the top, "Guest experience, discrimination, bias." His handwriting was neat, deliberate. He paused after each line, recalling moments in the lobby, the words said and unsaid. He noted the smirk, the assumptions, the silence from other staff. The discomfort wasn't personal, it was systemic. After several minutes of writing, Marcus sat back. His eyes lingered on the notes. There was no anger in his face, but a heaviness had settled there. A quiet disappointment. He then picked up the room phone and dialed the front desk. His voice remained polite. "I'd like to order room service," he said. "Could you send someone up?" 10 minutes passed. Marcus remained seated at the desk, reviewing documents, making quiet marks in the margins. Then, a soft knock on the door. He stood, walked to open it, and found himself face to face with Brad. Brad held the tray of food with both hands. His posture was stiff, and his eyes shifted nervously. His face had gone pale. The confidence from earlier was gone. He wasn't sneering now. He wasn't smiling. Just standing there, frozen, unsure what to say. "And Marcus?" He simply stepped aside and said, "Come in." Brad stepped into the suite, and immediately froze. The air felt heavier the moment he crossed the threshold. His eyes locked on Marcus, who was seated in the center of the lavish room, surrounded by elegance and gold. Marcus wasn't just sitting, he was composed, completely at ease, legs crossed, one hand resting on the armrest, the other holding a pen above a leather notebook. The sunlight poured through the tall windows behind him, casting a glow around his silhouette. He looked powerful, dignified, and nothing like the man Brad had mocked an hour earlier. Brad's throat went dry. His fingers clenched around the handles of the tray. "Room service," he muttered, voice low and unsteady. Marcus looked up. A small smile played at the corner of his lips. His tone was calm, not sarcastic. "Hello again," he said. "Nice to see you under better circumstances." Brad didn't smile back. He took a few steps in, the tray trembling slightly in his hands. His eyes darted from the chandelier to the velvet chairs, then back to Marcus. I just wanted to say," he began, words stumbling over each other, "if I said anything earlier that came off the wrong way, I apologize. I didn't mean to cause any offense." Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised. His voice was still soft, but it carried weight. "No problem," he replied. "I've been through worse." He paused, then added, "I've grown used to being underestimated." Brad shifted on his feet. His face turned red, then pale. He placed the tray carefully on the glass table in front of Marcus, trying not to knock over the crystal water glass beside it. Then he glanced at the papers spread across the desk. His eyes froze. There it was. The name. The logo. Bold and unmistakable. Lux Holdings. Brad leaned in slightly, just enough to make sure he wasn't imagining it. "You work for them?" he asked, his voice a whisper now, the confidence completely gone. Marcus didn't rush his answer. He closed the file gently and folded his hands. Then he looked Brad in the eye. "No," he said quietly. "I don't work for them." Brad blinked. He didn't understand. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "I own it." The words hit like a thunderclap. Brad's lips parted, but nothing came out. He took half a step back, as if retreating from the truth. His breath caught in his throat. For a second, he looked like a child who had just broken something priceless. He stood there, frozen, his pride stripped away. The room, the silence, the weight of his mistake, all of it pressed down on him. He had no clever reply. No excuse. Just disbelief and shame. Marcus said nothing more. He simply leaned back in his chair, that same quiet smile still resting on his face. The next morning, just after sunrise, an internal announcement was sent out across the Crystal Lux system. All staff were required to attend an emergency meeting at 9 a.m. sharp. No details were given. The message was short, formal, and unusual. Whispers filled the halls within minutes. By 8:50, the meeting room on the executive floor was buzzing with nervous energy. Brad sat near the back, his arms crossed, eyes darting between co-workers. Some were still chatting casually, others checking their phones, but the air felt tight, expectant. Everyone could sense something was coming, but no one knew what. At exactly 9 o'clock, Charlotte stepped to the front of the room. She looked calm, but her voice carried weight. "Last night," she began, "we welcomed a very important guest. Someone who saw more than just our decor or our skyline view." The room quieted instantly. Brad stiffened in his chair. He tried to appear relaxed, but his leg bounced under the table. Charlotte didn't say another word. Instead, she turned toward the door. A moment later, it opened. Marcus entered the room. He wore a tailored navy suit, crisp white shirt, and a dark silk tie. He walked with quiet authority, not rushing, not hesitating. All eyes turned to him. A few employees gasped softly. One of the kitchen staff whispered, "That's him." Brad's face drained of color. He sat motionless, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Marcus stopped at the front. He didn't look around, didn't search for anyone. He simply looked forward and began. "My name is Marcus Green," he said. "As of last quarter, I'm the new chairman of Lux Hotels." A wave of shock rippled through the room. Some staff leaned forward in disbelief. Others exchanged glances, eyes wide. Brad didn't move. Marcus clicked the remote in his hand, and a large screen behind him came to life. The title slide appeared, clean and direct. Service Culture and Anti-Discrimination Reform. He paused for a beat, letting the words sink in. Then he looked out across the room. His expression was calm, but firm. "What happened last night was more than a mistake," he said. "It was a mirror. And we need to take a hard look at what it's showing us." Marcus stood tall at the front of the room, the soft hum of the projector behind him. His voice was calm, but steady, each word deliberate. He began by outlining the new direction for Lux Hotels, a shift toward empathy, diversity, and true inclusiveness. He spoke not as a distant executive, but as someone who had lived through the very things the reform aimed to confront. "We are not just upgrading interiors," he said. "We are rebuilding values. This company must reflect the world we serve. Not just the privileged few, but every guest who walks through our doors." He paused, then shared a personal story. One of many. Times he had been ignored in high-end stores. Times he had been assumed to be staff instead of a customer. Times he had seen elevator doors close early, or been watched too closely in public spaces. "Not because of how I behaved," he said, but simply because of how I look. There was a quiet shift in the room. Some heads lowered. Others nodded slowly. A few employees looked visibly moved. The recognition in their eyes wasn't just about guilt, it was understanding. Charlotte, standing to the side, chose her next words carefully. "Mr. Green," she asked, "would you be willing to share more about your experience at this particular branch?" Marcus looked directly at her. Then at the room. His voice didn't rise, but his message deepened. "A few individuals," he said, "damaged the reputation of this hotel far more than any bad review could. Because what they showed was not a lapse in service. It was a failure of character." Brad sat frozen. He didn't raise his head. His hands were clenched in his lap, his shoulders tight. He knew Marcus was speaking about him, though his name hadn't been said. The silence around him was deafening. Marcus turned back to the screen, then added, "There is no place for bias in this company. No space for judgment rooted in ignorance. Reform doesn't happen through silence. It happens through action." No one spoke. Not a breath was wasted. The room was still, as if holding its breath. The truth had been spoken, and it echoed in every corner. After the meeting ended, most of the staff lingered in silence. No one rushed to leave. Conversations were hushed, thoughtful. But Marcus stayed behind. He waited until the room was nearly empty. Then he walked toward Charlotte and handed her a white envelope. His face was composed, but serious. Charlotte took it without a word. She opened it slowly, read the contents, then nodded. Her expression shifted from neutral to resolved. Inside was a formal request, signed and dated, authorizing the termination of Brad's employment. A few minutes later, Brad was called into a side office. He stepped in, still pale, his hands twitching slightly at his sides. Marcus and Charlotte stood across from him. The silence in the room was heavy. "This is about what happened yesterday," Brad said quickly, his voice rushed. "I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a misunderstanding. A joke, maybe. That's all." Marcus didn't flinch. His eyes were steady, direct. "You made someone feel small," he said. "And that is never a joke. Not in this industry. Not in this company." Brad's mouth opened, then closed. The words wouldn't come. His face turned red. He looked at the floor, nodded slowly, and said nothing more. When he walked out of that office, he passed by several co-workers. No one smiled. No one stopped him. The silence followed him out. But Marcus wasn't finished. He turned back to Charlotte and asked for one more thing. "Who was the young man who brought my tray last night?" he asked. "The one who didn't speak much, but looked me in the eye." Charlotte checked her records, then nodded. "That's Kevin. He's new. Works nights. Just started last week." Marcus smiled softly. "He treated me with dignity. Quiet, but respectful. That matters." He paused. "I want him promoted to concierge. Effective immediately." Charlotte nodded again. "Consider it done." Marcus looked around the now empty room, then said quietly, "From today forward, this place will be different." Later that evening, as the hotel began to settle back into its usual rhythm, one of the junior staff members opened their phone and started typing. They described what they had witnessed that morning, how a guest, mocked for his appearance, turned out to be the new owner of the entire hotel chain. They didn't name names. They didn't exaggerate. Just facts. Just truth. They ended the post with a quiet reflection: "Maybe we should stop assuming we know someone's worth by the way they look." Within hours, the story spread like wildfire. The headline practically wrote itself: "Hotel guest mocked for his appearance turns out to be the CEO." It was picked up by blogs, shared across platforms, and quoted by influencers. People were stunned by the irony, moved by the dignity of Marcus's response, and outraged by the prejudice he endured. Comment sections overflowed with support. "He handled it with more grace than most of us ever could," one user wrote. "This man is a class act," said another. Thousands agreed. The impact didn't stop online. Other hotels began examining their own service culture. Internal memos circulated. Meetings were scheduled. Some even reached out to Lux Holdings, asking for guidance on training and reform. Soon after, a major television network reached out to Marcus for an interview. He accepted, sitting down in a quiet studio under soft lights. The interviewer asked him how it felt to be underestimated, how he stayed so composed. Marcus thought for a moment, then replied, "Not everyone who's wealthy looks like someone from a movie. And not everyone who looks different is out of place." That one sentence traveled farther than anyone expected. It was quoted, reposted, turned into headlines. Teachers discussed it in classrooms. Executives printed it in newsletters. It hit something deep. A truth too many had felt, but few had said aloud. Marcus didn't ask for the spotlight. But now that it found him, he used it for something larger. His name became associated with fairness, with quiet strength, and with a new standard for how people in the service industry should be seen and treated. Later that night, after the interviews were over and the calls had quieted down, Marcus returned to his suite. The city outside shimmered through the windows, but inside the room, everything was still. He sat down slowly, the weight of the day finally settling into his shoulders. Just as he reached for a glass of water, his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and smiled. It was his mother. He answered quickly. "Hi, Mom." Her voice came through with warmth, steady and proud. "Son, I saw you on TV," she said. "You looked strong. You looked like yourself. I'm proud of you." Marcus leaned back, eyes softening. "You always told me not to let anyone decide my worth," he said quietly. "Not based on my body, not based on my skin." His mother chuckled gently. "Exactly," she said. "So what if you're big? So what if you're dark? Anyone who dares to look down on you will regret it, and they should." Marcus laughed softly, but there was emotion behind it. "Well," he replied, "someone learned that lesson today. The hard way." There was a pause. A peaceful silence between them. Then his mother spoke again. Her tone was firm but kind. "You have power now," she said. "Real power. Use it. Not to punish. To protect. Be the kind of man others can turn to." Marcus stood and walked to the window. The city lights blinked like stars below. He looked out for a long moment before answering. "I promise, Mom," he whispered. "I will." A tear slid down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just stood there, letting it fall, surrounded by silence, by light, and by the quiet strength he had carried with him all along. A week later, Marcus called for a national meeting with all Lux Hotels branches. It was the first of its kind. Every manager, every department head, every team leader logged in. The screen filled with faces, some curious, some cautious. Marcus appeared at the center, not behind a desk, but standing, open, direct. He began by thanking everyone. Then his tone shifted. He spoke about what true hospitality means, not just polished floors or perfect room service, but the way people are treated when no one is watching. He emphasized dignity, kindness, and most of all, inclusion. Not just in branding or marketing, but in action, policy, and mindset. "We serve people," Marcus said, "and people come in every shape, every background, every shade. No one should feel less welcome because of how they look, speak, or move." With that, he introduced a sweeping new policy. A zero-tolerance stance on discrimination, regardless of race, body size, age, or appearance. It wasn't just a memo. It was a foundation. Every employee, from the front desk to the kitchen, would undergo retraining. Not just on procedures, but on empathy. On how to read a moment without assumptions. On how to offer service that uplifts, not diminishes. He also launched an anonymous guest feedback program. Every visitor would have the chance to report their experiences without fear, helping to spotlight issues that might go unseen. Those who had been mistreated in the past were invited back, free of charge. An apology, in action. The change wasn't just cosmetic. It went deep. Hiring policies were revised. Diversity was tracked, celebrated, and prioritized. Leaders were held accountable. Marcus sat down after the meeting and opened his notebook. He turned to a fresh page. At the top, he wrote slowly, with a steady hand, "This is only the beginning." He walked in as a man dismissed for how he looked. He left as the one who redefined what that place would stand for. From someone judged for his skin and his size, Marcus became the force that reshaped an entire system. This story is not just about one man. It is about what happens when someone dares to lead with dignity, not ego. When someone answers cruelty not with revenge, but with reform. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand attention. He simply stood in truth, and let that truth speak for itself. And it changed everything. So if you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or treated as if you didn't belong, know this. You are not alone. And your story matters. Because behind every quiet face may be a voice the world desperately needs to hear. Never judge someone by the way they look. You never know who they are. And more importantly, you never know what you might lose by turning them away. If you've ever faced something similar, share your story below. It might be the reminder someone else needs today. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, share this video, and stay connected. There are more stories ahead. Stories that challenge, uplift, and remind us what humanity looks like when we choose better. Thank you for staying with us until the end. We'll see you in the next story.